In this lesson, we're going to talk a little bit about St. John Baptist de La Salle's philosophy, what he considered to be the biggest, not the only problem, but the biggest problem in France during the time that he was alive, and what he thought the solution to those problems could be. Your job during this, because I've already given you this diagram in Notes Help, is to make sure that you have definitions to the underlying terms, and then have a general idea of how De La Salle believed that education would solve these problems. So pay attention to the parts in yellow towards the end. Alright, so De La Salle believed that the biggest problem, not the only, but the biggest problem was the bad the economy, in particular for the working people and the poor. That when you have this bad economy and these bad conditions, it'll lead to a couple of different things. The first is just general ignorance. People are not going to be educated. They're not going to be aware of what is happening. And the second is lawlessness. Because if someone cannot afford to feed themselves, they will find a way to feed themselves through stealing it or whatever the case may be. And so this will cause other greater problems, all tied back to this one issue. He believed the solution to this was free Christian schools. Free Christian schools is the name that he gave to all of his schools. Okay, so instead of having, just in Siena, all of his schools were just named the Free Christian Schools. And so it kind of gave an idea to everyone of what his schools were about very quickly. But if you're going to run a school, you need a couple of different things. Number one, you need to have financial support. You need to have a building. You need to have heat. You need to have school supplies. You also need to have competent, good teachers in order for this school to be successful. So he'll have to take those things into consideration and figure out a way to do this. In these schools, he would provide three different things. The first is secular instruction. Secular just means like non-religious, everyday, normal instruction. So number one is literary basics, right? The ability to read. But because there was no system of education, he had to take a step back. He had to start with the ABCs, right? And what does each letter say and all of those kinds of things. So the literary basics. And hopefully in time, kids could build up to reading and all of that kind of stuff. The second major change he made was that he would teach in the vernacular. Schools at that moment in time taught in Latin exclusively. Latin was the language of the educated, and De La Salle didn't really see a need for that. Instead of teaching in Latin, he wanted to teach in the vernacular, which is the everyday language of the people. So, since he was living in 17th century France, the vernacular at that moment in time would have been French. So instead of going to school to learn Latin, he taught everyone in French because that was more practical and more useful for them to get a job and keep a job. So those are the main things that he would teach in class. But he also would create a school where there is social formation, learning how to interact with one another, right? So the first major change that he really brings in and popularizes is the simultaneous method of instruction. Simultaneous method of instruction is one teacher and many students. And this is a change because before this, most education happened in one-on-one. A family would hire a private tutor. That private tutor would come into the house and they would educate you. Maybe your brothers, not sisters. Sisters were never usually educated. And instead of doing a one-on-one teacher's environment, that becomes very expensive and you can't really reach that many people. He decides to shift to the model and have one teacher who provides an education, to many students. So then you begin to learn from each other, right? In a classroom, you get to learn from the teacher, but you also get to learn from each of your classmates. So in effect, you move from one teacher to 30 teachers, depending on how many classmates are in the room. The second thing he does is he creates collaborative schools. And collaborative schools are schools where every student has a job. Don't think of vocational training necessarily. Think more of like in kindergarten where you had the line leader, or you had somebody who was in charge of saying the days of the week, or the greeter at the door. Every student has a job and has a responsibility, and so has something to contribute to the classroom and learns that if I'm not there, my job doesn't happen that way. And so he creates this idea of a collaborative school. The last thing he does is teach religious instruction. And this way, students are able to understand the prayers they are saying, understand what is happening at church, because church happened in Latin. And he also helped students get to the point where they could read the Bible themselves and begin to take out Bible lessons from them. And so those are the things that he believed that his schools should provide. If he does this, then his schools will provide vocational competence. By giving everyone a secular education, everyone will have the ability to get a job. This is vocational. Vocational, we tend to translate into the sense of job, right? So competence to be able to get and hold on to maintain a job. You also will have people who develop a sense of responsibility, and a sense of responsibility to their society, to each other. People who will contribute and pay taxes, right? People who will want to vote once a voting system eventually comes into place. All of those, that people who want for the good of society, right? And all of that is kind of tied back to the idea of a Christian spirit. The idea of a religious formation, absolutely, for those who are Catholic, and France was a Catholic country, right? That people will have a deeper sense of their beliefs, that they will know what their religion believes, that they will agree or disagree, but they will know why. And they will develop their own sense of spirit. Okay? So that is De La Salle's philosophy. Thanks.